Hey guys, tonight we slip into a dry, starlit landscape where sand gets into everything, including history, and you can almost hear old ink crackle in the dark as if the page itself is breathing. You are here for a question that sounds like trouble in the best way. What if the Book of Enoch was removed because it tells the real origin of humanity? Some parts of what you will hear are widely accepted history about ancient Jewish writings and how communities chose their sacred books. Some parts are interpretation because historians debate motives more than they debate dates. And some parts are calm, cinematic, what-if imagination because it is late and your brain loves a mystery snack before sleep. Also, fair warning. You probably won't survive this emotionally if you are the kind of person who can't handle the idea that adults once lost important paperwork. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell me your location and local time in the comments, because I like knowing where the night is falling as we talk. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through a desert that does not care about your theories. The air is cool, the sky is rinsed clean, and the stars look like someone spilled salt across the black velvet. You taste dust, not the dramatic movie dust. The ordinary dust that settles on everything and quietly wins arguments over centuries. In your hand, you carry a small oil lamp that throws a warm circle on the ground, and outside that circle, the world turns into a gentle blur. It is the kind of night that makes you whisper even if no one asked you to. Most historians agree that the Book of Enoch, at least parts of it, circulated widely among Jewish communities in the centuries before and around the time of Jesus. That is the solid ground. You can feel it under your feet like packed earth. It was copied, shared, read, and argued over. It was not some lonely little pamphlet hiding in a corner like a shy ghost. It had a life. And yet, you also know the frustrating part. If you open most Bibles today, you do not find it sitting neatly between familiar pages, smiling politely like it belongs there. So the mind does what it always does late at night. It invents a scene. You imagine a door closing. You imagine powerful men with serious beards and serious opinions, stacking scrolls and deciding what the world is allowed to read. You imagine a hand reaching over the table, lifting one scroll, and sliding it quietly away. You imagine someone saying, in a voice that sounds like authority, "This one is too much." That is a mood, not evidence. It is important to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So you let the lamp swing gently as you walk, and you take the question apart like a careful mechanic, not like a conspiracy detective with a corkboard and a red string budget, more like someone checking what actually fits. First, you picture the ancient world as it really is, at least as best as scholarship can reconstruct. There is no single universal bookshelf called the Bible in the early centuries. There are libraries in temples and private homes. There are scribes copying texts by hand, which is basically the ancient version of retyping an entire website by candlelight, except your back hurts more and you do not get paid in likes. There are communities with different favourite writings. Some texts feel essential to one group and optional to another. Some texts are read for wisdom, some are read for comfort. Some are read because they are spicy, and humans have always loved spicy. In that world, removed can mean something quieter than a villain stealing the truth. It can mean a text gradually loses its central place in public worship. It can mean leaders decide it is not reliable enough, or not useful enough, or too easy to misunderstand. It can mean it survives in some regions and disappears in others. it can mean a community copies it less. And then, because copying is how you keep a text alive, it starts fading like footsteps in sand. You pause on a ridge and look down at low hills. Somewhere out there, long ago, a person hid scrolls in caves. That is not just imagination. Archaeology suggests that groups connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved a wide variety of writings, including texts associated with Enoch. The evidence we do have points to Enoch being valued in at least some circles, enough to be copied and kept with care. So the question shifts. If a book is valued, why does it not become universal scripture for everyone? Now you start walking again, and the lamp glow bobs with your steps, like a slow heartbeat. One interpretation is that the issue is not secret origin knowledge at all, but authority. In many traditions, sacred books do not become sacred simply because they are interesting. They become sacred because communities recognize them as fitting their core story, their worship, and their identity. Some texts speak in a voice that feels stable, anchored in a known tradition. Other texts speak with wild visionary intensity, and that intensity can be both thrilling and hard to manage. And the Book of Enoch is, to put it gently, not shy. It is full of visions, journeys, cosmic geography, angelic names, and bold claims about heavenly secrets. It reads like someone opened a trapdoor in the sky and invited you to peek. That can inspire devotion, but it can also create anxiety. Leaders who are trying to keep a community together sometimes prefer texts that unify rather than electrify. That is a cautious explanation, and it fits what we know about how religious communities often behave. Still, your original question keeps tapping your shoulder. What if the reason is darker? What if it really does tell the real origin of humanity? You let the desert answer you in its slow way, a soft wind, a hiss of sand, no clear yes or no. To explore that possibility without tripping into certainty, you begin by asking what Enoch is actually doing with origins. Most mainstream readers associate human origins with creation, Eden, Adam and Eve. Enoch does not replace that story so much as expand the drama around it. It zooms in on a different kind of beginning, not the beginning of bodies, but the beginning of corruption, the beginning of forbidden knowledge, the beginning of a world where power crosses boundaries. This is where the famous Watchers enter the scene. Even if you only know the summary, you can feel why this gets people excited. Divine beings. Watchers descend. They cross a line. They teach humans things that feel dangerous. They trigger consequences. The story frames human history as entangled with heavenly rebellion. It is an origin story of a different type, an origin of moral fracture. A careful reading might suggest that the book is less interested in explaining how humans were made, and more interested in explaining why humans struggle, why the world feels bent, why injustice looks like it has deep roots, why knowledge can become a weapon. That interpretation does not require a secret cover-up. It requires only that people recognize the text as powerful, and power makes communities cautious. And now you notice the weirdest part of your own curiosity. You are not only curious about Enoch's content, you are curious about the act of choosing. The moment a community says yes to one text and no to another, that moment feels like a hinge in history, because it is. Here is the line you need to hear, said gently and clearly. Historians still argue whether the boundaries of Scripture were mostly set by formal councils, by gradual communal habit, or by a mix of both. That debate matters because if removal was not a single event, then a single villain cannot explain it. The story becomes more human. And honestly, humans are often more complicated than villains. Villains at least show up on time. You keep walking, and the lamp throws your shadow long and thin over the sand. You imagine a scribe in a small room, copying by hand. Every letter is a decision. Every smudge is a future headache for scholars. The scribe has limited time, limited materials, limited patience, and probably a limited supply of snacks. Copying a long visionary book is labour, and labour is expensive, so communities copy what they use the most. Now imagine a community that reads Enoch privately, maybe for inspiration or warning, but does not read it publicly every week. That community might still respect it, even love it, but copy it less. Over decades. Less copying means fewer surviving copies. Over centuries. Fewer copies means it becomes rare. By the time later communities are drawing sharper lines around what counts as scripture, the rare texts are easier to leave out. Not because of a secret, but because of momentum. That is one plausible pathway, but you are here for the what if. So you let your imagination walk beside you like a quiet friend who does not insist it is right. What if there really was a moment, not a council with dramatic speeches, but a simple, private decision? A teacher notices that people are obsessing over angels and secret names. People are using Enoch to map the sky like it is a code book. People are arguing about which angel taught which art, like it is fantasy sports for the supernatural. The teacher worries that the community is drifting away from the ethical heart of their faith. So the teacher says, calmly, we will read the Torah publicly, we will read the prophets, we will keep our focus. This other writing can be read, but it will not be our foundation. No conspiracy, just a leader trying to keep a group from spiralling into obsession. And yet, the result feels similar to removal. The book is pushed from the centre to the edge. Your lamp sputters. You adjust the wick, and for a moment the flame flares brighter, making the sand glitter. It is a small reminder of how fragile transmission is, how easily a thing survives or dies based on ordinary conditions. Now you arrive at a cluster of stones. In your mind, it is an entrance to a cave. You crouch and duck inside, and the air changes. Cooler. Still. The smell of mineral and old dryness. In the dark, you imagine bundles of scrolls wrapped carefully, like someone packing away part of their soul. This is where the cinematic mood can do something useful. It can help you remember that ancient people did not think like modern people. They did not have mass printing. They did not have cloud storage. They had hands, ink, and time. If a book survived, someone loved it enough to copy it. If it disappeared, it might have been because no one had enough resources or enough reasons to keep copying it. Still, the question of real origin is stubborn. What do people mean when they say Enoch tells the real origin of humanity? Often, they mean the Watchers. They mean that humans were influenced, or engineered, or altered by beings from above. They mean that our knowledge, our technologies, maybe even our DNA, has a supernatural or extraterrestrial twist. That idea is popular in modern storytelling, and it is easy to see why. It makes the universe feel bigger. It makes you feel like a character in a cosmic drama, rather than a person trying to remember where you left your keys. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we have to ask what the ancient text itself is doing. In its historical context, the Watcher's story can be read as a mythic explanation for the presence of evil and forbidden arts in society. It can be a critique of oppressive power. It can be a warning that knowledge without wisdom can wreck communities. It can also be a way of dramatizing the idea that the world is morally serious, that injustice matters, that hidden things will be judged. Those are mainstream safe interpretations that fit how apocalyptic literature often works. At the same time, a fringe idea proposes that the Watcher's language is coded memory of a real encounter with outsiders, maybe advanced beings, maybe something stranger. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the imagery is vivid, and the human mind loves to connect dots. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in this case, the evidence for literal outsiders is thin. What we have is a text, a tradition, and a lot of modern imagination. But thin evidence does not stop late-night curiosity, does it? You sit on a stone inside the cave and let the lamplight dance on the walls. The shadows look like moving letters. Your mind starts to build a scene again. You imagine a reader in antiquity, hearing Enoch and feeling the hair on their arms rise, not because it is true in a modern documentary sense, but because it resonates. It speaks to the feeling that something is off in the world, that power abuses, that knowledge can be corrupted, that the divine realm is not distant, it is involved. And then you imagine another reader, centuries later, who finds that involvement uncomfortable. Because once you start naming angels, once you start mapping heavens, once you start telling people that cosmic beings taught humans forbidden skills, you open doors to speculation that can outrun ethics. Communities trying to stay grounded might step back. So maybe removed is not a villain's act. Maybe it is a community's seatbelt. The desert wind slips into the cave mouth and whispers across your lamp flame. It makes a soft, calming sound, like someone shushing you. But kindly, you stand and walk out again, back under the stars, and now you hold two ideas at once without forcing them to fight. 1. Enoch was widely known and influential in certain ancient Jewish contexts, which is documented in the broad outline of manuscript discoveries and literary influence. 2. The reason it did not become universal scripture may be more about slow selection, communal habits, and theological caution than about hiding a real origin secret. And then, for the cinematic what if, you allow a third idea to drift like a cloud across the moon. What if the sand really did hide a moment? Not a grand conspiracy, not a worldwide purge, but a small decision that changed what most people would grow up reading. A teacher chooses simplicity over spectacle. A scribe chooses to copy a different scroll because parchment is expensive. A community chooses texts that stabilise them after trauma. A library burns in a war and takes rare copies with it. A language shifts, and a book not translated becomes harder to access. A chain of ordinary events leads to extraordinary absence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You look up at the stars again, and for a second you feel how huge time is. How many hands touch these stories? How many choices were made quietly? And you realise the most sleepily unsettling possibility is not that someone hid the truth. It is that the truth, whatever it is, had to travel through fragile human habits to reach you at all. Your lamp is low now. The flame is smaller. The desert is still. And you keep walking with that soft, steady thought, letting it settle into you like warm sand settling after a breeze. You step into a windless valley where the night feels padded, like the world is trying not to wake anyone. The sky is still crowded with stars, but down here the darkness gathers in soft layers between rocks. You can smell cold stone and a faint metallic tang that makes you think of old tools. Somewhere a small insect clicks once, as if testing the sound system, then decides silence is better, and now the story tightens its focus to a single strange claim that keeps pulling at human imagination. Watchers descend, not metaphorical watchers like your neighbour peeking through curtains, not the kind of watcher who binge watches a series and forgets to drink water. These are luminous beings in a mythic register, described as crossing from a higher realm into the human world. Most historians agree that the Book of Enoch belongs to a wider family of Second Temple Jewish writings that use visionary language to explore big questions: evil, justice, cosmic order, and the feeling that history is being watched. That is the solid ground. The text is not floating in isolation. It is part of an era where people told stories about heaven and earth as if they were neighbours sharing a fence. One interpretation is that the Watcher's story dramatises an old idea found across the ancient Near East: the divine council, a heavenly assembly of powerful beings. That does not mean every culture told it the same way. It means the imagination of the region often pictured the cosmos as structured, populated, and politically complicated, like a city with upper floors and lower floors and lots of rules about who can go where. If you have ever tried to sneak into a hotel breakfast buffet you did not pay for, you already understand the tension. So the Watchers are beings who, in the story, break protocol. They do not stay in their place. They come down, they teach, they meddle. And the text presents that meddling as a turning point. Now, here is where your brain wants to sprint into modern theories, like a dog spotting an open field, aliens, ancient astronauts, genetic engineering, a hidden origin, a cosmic experiment. Let me rephrase that more carefully before your imagination buys a whole shopping cart of assumptions. The Watcher's narrative can be read in more than one way, and responsible listening keeps those layers distinct. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented. Most scholars recognise that the story is shaped like a mythic explanation. It is answering a question: why is the world so tangled with harm and injustice? And why does knowledge sometimes feel like it has teeth? Interpreted. Some readers see the Watchers as symbolic of human elites, foreign powers, or corrupt teachers who introduce destructive practices. In that reading, the dissent is political or moral, not biological. The heavenly language becomes a mask for social critique, a safe way to talk about dangerous realities without naming names. Imagined. You can still let the descent feel cinematic. You can hear the hush of wings that are not exactly wings. You can picture the horizon shimmering like heat, even at night, as if the air itself is a curtain being pulled aside. You walk along a dry riverbed, and under your feet the stones are smooth, warmed by water that is not here anymore. It is a good metaphor. Honestly, some forces are absent now, but the shape they left remains. Enoch describes the Watchers as teaching humans forbidden arts. Depending on the tradition and translation, these include things like metalwork, weapon making, cosmetics, astrology, and methods of manipulating nature. Scholars continue to debate how literal these lists are meant to be. One interpretation is that the author is critiquing specific cultural practices and warning that certain kinds of knowledge accelerate corruption. It is possible that the text reflects anxieties about urbanization, empire, and technologies that change society faster than ethics can keep up. In other words, the Watchers are not just beings. They are a narrative device for a very human worry: the fear that humans can learn the wrong things too well. If you squint, it feels uncomfortably modern. You can practically hear the ancient version of someone saying, "We were not ready for this update." Now you reach a place where the valley opens and the wind returns in a slow, steady stream. It brushes your face like a cool hand. Your lamp flame bends sideways. You shield it with your palm, and the light turns your fingers orange and translucent, like you are briefly made of ember. The Watcher's myth hinges on boundaries. Heaven and earth are separate domains. The Watchers cross the boundary. They mingle with humans. In the story, that produces a messy outcome. So the lesson is partly about limits, Not everything that can happen should happen. Not every door should be opened just because it has a handle. That is the mainstream safe reading. But because you are here for mystery too, you let the other possibility stroll in without demanding it take over the room. A fringe idea proposes that ancient people preserved distorted memories of encounters with beings they perceived as non-human in this view. Heaven could be interpreted as a different realm, not necessarily spiritual, maybe technological, maybe extraterrestrial, maybe something we do not have words for. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has cultural staying power because it turns myth into a kind of archive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what would need to be true for that to work. We would need consistent, independent evidence that such encounters occurred. We would need archaeological traces that clearly point beyond ordinary ancient capabilities. We would need more than poetic vision language, and right now, the evidence we do have points mainly to literature, themes, and shared mythic motifs, not to hard, unambiguous proof of literal outsiders. That does not kill the mystery, it simply keeps it from pretending it is more solid than it is. We are not proving anything tonight, we are following clues, and a clue can be emotional as well as factual. The watcher's story feels like it is touching a nerve, and nerves usually connect to something real, even if it is real in the realm of psychology, not biology. You notice something else as you walk. The watcher's story is not just about knowledge, it is about the cost of knowledge. In Enoch, secret teachings are not neutral. They tilt the world. They create imbalance. They invite judgment. The text frames a cosmos where moral order is built in, like gravity. You can ignore it for a while, but eventually you fall. That brings you to the question of why such a story would make communities nervous. Here is a practical reason, and you can almost hear it in a tired teacher's voice. If people latch onto angelic secrets, they might start valuing secret knowledge over ethical living. They might chase hidden names, hidden calendars, hidden techniques, and forget the plain work of justice, kindness, and restraint. They might treat spirituality like a scavenger hunt. And yes, that is a problem that never went extinct. The text's angelology, the elaborate naming and ranking of heavenly beings, can be spiritually rich, but it can also feed obsession. That is why. Across time, some religious leaders have been cautious about visionary literature, not because it is fake, but because it is potent. Potent things require careful handling. You stop at a boulder that rises like a blunt monument, and you rest your hand on it. The stone is cold. It does not care what you believe. It just is. That is your grounding object tonight. Historians still argue whether the Watcher's tradition should be read primarily as mythic theology, coded social commentary, or a patchwork of older stories adapted for new crises. And because they argue, you are allowed to hover in the uncertainty without panic. You do not have to pick a team. You can keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now, to keep the night moving, you shift to a new development. The Watcher's story is also a story about language. Think about how ancient people talk about the world. They use the vocabulary available to them. If they want to describe power that feels beyond human scale, they might use angels. If they want to describe knowledge that changes society, they might frame it as forbidden teaching from above. It is possible that the myth is a compression of many realities: political upheaval, technological change, cultural mixing, and the moral disorientation that follows. A more cautious explanation could be that the Watchers are a way of externalizing blame. Instead of saying, humans invented violence and exploitation, the narrative says, a corruption came from above. This does not excuse humans, because Enoch still holds humans accountable. but it places the origin of certain corruptions in a cosmic drama, making the stakes feel absolute. And absolute stakes are emotionally satisfying. They make suffering feel meaningful. They make injustice feel temporary. They promise that the universe has an opinion. If you have ever been wronged and wished the sky itself would file a complaint on your behalf, you understand why this literature exists. Now your lamplight catches something on the ground, a shard of pottery half buried in sand. You pick it up. It is smooth on one side, rough on the other. It was once part of a bowl, something ordinary, used for water or grain. It is not a relic of angels. It is a relic of dinner. You hold it anyway, because it reminds you that ancient life was mostly ordinary life. People cooked. They argued. They loved. They got tired. They tried to make sense of the world. They told stories that could carry meaning across generations. So when the Watcher's story says beings came down and taught humans, one interpretation is that it is speaking to the anxiety of cultural transmission. New knowledge often comes from outside. It comes from foreigners, from travellers, from empires, from trade networks. It can enrich a society, but it can also destabilise it. Communities sometimes interpret destabilisation as moral danger. They may frame foreign influence as a kind of seduction. In that lens, Watchers could be the mythic face of the outsider, and now the cinematic what-if drifts in like a soft fog. What if the outsider was not just a neighbouring culture? What if it was truly other? What if the story preserves a faint echo of an encounter that later became spiritualised because there was no other language for it? You do not have to believe that to let it be eerie. You can let it be eerie as a possibility, the way you can enjoy a ghost story without calling a plumber for your soul. The wind rises a little and the stars seem to sharpen. You tuck the pottery shard into a small pouch, not because it is valuable, but because it is a tactile reminder that stories come from hands. Your thoughts settle on a balanced conclusion for this stretch of the journey. The Watcher's narrative, on solid historical footing, belongs to an ancient environment of mythic theology and apocalyptic imagination. Interpreted carefully, it may critique the misuse of knowledge and the crossing of boundaries, reflecting real social pressures and ethical concerns. Imagined gently, it can also be read as a whispered possibility of something stranger, a brush with the unknown that the text transforms into sacred drama. And if a community later hesitated to centre such a narrative in its official scriptures, that hesitation could have been motivated by practical concerns about interpretation, devotion, and unity, not necessarily by a desire to hide a literal origin secret. You keep walking through the valley, the lamp steady, the night quiet, and the Watchers, whether symbolic or mysterious, remain what they have always been in this story, a mirror held up to human longing, human fear, and human fascination with the idea that the sky has been watching you the whole time. You move into a wide plain where the ground is pale and powdery, and your footsteps make a soft crunch like you are walking on stale sugar. The air smells faintly of dry herbs, the kind that cling to rocks and refuse to die, which honestly feels like an attitude worth copying. Your lamp glows low and steady, and the flame makes the nearest pebbles look like tiny moons. Tonight the story offers you a new shape of mystery, one that feels heavier than angels and more awkward to store in a neat theology closet. Giants. Most historians agree that tales of unusually large beings show up across many ancient cultures, especially around the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. That is not unique to any one tradition. The evidence we do have points to a shared human habit. When people want to talk about overwhelming power, they often give it a body that is literally too big for the room. It is a narrative shortcut. You do not have to explain oppression in 5 paragraphs, if you can say. And then something enormous stepped on the village. In the Book of Enoch's world, the giants are tied to the Watcher's story. They become an outgrowth of boundary crossing and forbidden teaching. And in the narrative, they are one of the reasons the world seems to tip into chaos. The image is vivid, and vivid images behave like magnets. They pull modern theories toward them. But let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented. The giants theme has literary roots in older biblical material, especially brief passages that hint at strange unions and legendary figures. Enoch expands those hints into a full dramatic arc. That is a common ancient practice. A short, mysterious note becomes a whole story that tries to explain what the note might mean. Interpreted, many scholars read Enoch's giants as a moral warning, dressed in mythic clothing. One interpretation is that giants represent predatory elites, violent warlords, or imperial forces that devour resources and leave ordinary people feeling small. In that reading, the giants do not need to be biological giants. They are social giants. They are the kind of power that eats your grain, taxes your labour, and still complains you did not smile enough. And then there is the cinematic what if that tiptoes in, wearing soft slippers so it does not wake your sceptical brain. What if the giants are not only symbolism? What if they are a distant memory of real beings? Real anomalies, real events that felt too strange to forget and too strange to describe plainly. You let that possibility hover like a moth near the lamp flame. Close enough to see, not so close that it burns the whole night down. Now you take a fresh path into the question, because the giants are not only about size, they are also about genealogy. Enoch leans into lineage as destiny. It treats certain unions as contamination and certain teachings as corruptive, and it imagines consequences rippling through generations. That is a powerful idea in the ancient world, where ancestry is not a hobby, it is identity. You do not just have a family tree, you have a family anchor, you have inherited obligations, you have inherited reputations. Sometimes you have inherited that one uncle who insists on telling the same story every holiday, ancient or modern. Some inheritances are unavoidable. So when Enoch talks about giants as offspring, it is also talking about what happens when boundaries break and when power reproduces itself. It is a narrative about how corruption multiplies. Most mainstream readers can understand that without needing literal giant skeletons. But of course, the internet exists, and the internet loves skeletons. A popular rumour claims that giant human bones have been discovered and hidden away to protect official history. This rumour shows up in modern folklore and viral storytelling, and it tends to travel faster than careful archaeology, which is admittedly less exciting because archaeologists usually do not burst through walls yelling, "Behold, a femur." They mostly kneel quietly, brush dirt gently, and argue about soil layers like it is the most intense book club in the world. To be clear, this is debated, and the sensational claims of hidden giant skeletons are not widely accepted in mainstream scholarship. That does not mean you cannot enjoy the frisson of the rumour. It means you treat it as a rumour, not a conclusion. If we keep our feet on solid ground, a more cautious explanation could be that giants function as mythic shorthand for ancient anxieties about violence, social collapse, and the misuse of knowledge. Enoch's giants are not friendly big cousins who help you move furniture. They are a moral catastrophe in a body. You walk toward a shallow depression in the plain where the wind has carved a bowl shape in the earth. In the centre is a scatter of stones, and your lamp makes their shadows pile up like little black pyramids. You crouch and touch one stone. It is warmer than you expect. still holding the day's heat. It reminds you that the past holds heat too, even when it looks cold. Here is another new development to keep your mind from looping. Enoch's giant story also works as a critique of appetite. In the narrative, the giants consume excessively. They take too much. They devour. They are hunger with legs. That theme is ancient and timeless. When societies fall apart, one common explanation is that someone somewhere took more than they needed, and everyone else paid the price. In that sense, giants are an ethical teaching tool. They show you what happens when appetite becomes law. One interpretation is that Enoch's author is condemning systems that produce endless consumption, endless violence, and endless inequality. If you strip away the mythic imagery, you are left with a message that sounds very modern. Unchecked power grows until it harms everything around it. And then the cinematic what-if slips behind that message and whispers, what if the myth remembers a literal disaster too? Not necessarily giants as creatures, but giants as events. Famine, war, mass displacement, the collapse of local order under larger empires. In the ancient world, such events can feel like monsters. They can feel bigger than human scale. They can feel like something non-human is chewing on the edges of your life. So perhaps giants are an emotional fossil, preserving the shape of terror and instability in a form the mind can carry. That is interpretation, not certainty. You stand and look out across the plain. Far away, a ridgeline breaks the horizon, and the sky above it looks slightly lighter, as if the universe is thinking about dawn but has not committed. You breathe slowly, your own body feels small and real, and that is grounding. Now you approach the deeper question hidden inside the user's question, origin. If Enoch tells the real origin of humanity, what kind of origin could it mean in the context of giants? A careful reading might suggest that the origin here is not the creation of humans, but the origin of human brokenness. In Enoch's story, violence and exploitation are intensified by knowledge delivered without wisdom. The giants become a symbol of what happens when power and technique grow faster than conscience. So if someone says Enoch reveals the real origin, they may be responding to this idea, that humanity's defining struggle is not merely disobedience in a garden, but the entanglement of humans with corrupting influences, whether those influences are framed as angels, empires, or the seductions of technology and domination. That is an origin of moral history, and it can feel more psychologically satisfying than a simple rule break because it gives you a more complex world. It says, of course, life is complicated. Look how the complications began. Now, because you deserve one clear debate marker in the night, here it is, placed gently like a stone on a trail. Historians still argue whether the giants in these traditions should be read as purely mythic symbolism, as polemic against violent elites, or as elaborations built from older legendary fragments. That argument exists because texts like Enoch sit at the crossroads of myth, theology, and social commentary. They are not simple. You walk again, and your lamplight swings side to side, and the motion makes the stone seem to drift, like the world is breathing. You notice a small animal track in the dust, a delicate pattern. It crosses your path and disappears. That is how many ancient traces are a line, a curve. They're nothing, and you still try to tell a story from it. So what about the claim that Enoch was removed because the giants reveal too much? One interpretation is that communities might avoid centering a text that could encourage speculative obsession. Giants and watcher offspring can lead to endless arguments about biology, angels, and hidden bloodlines. And when people focus on hidden bloodlines, they sometimes start sorting humans into categories, which is a recipe for moral disaster. Leaders aiming for unity could have been wary of a book that might fuel divisive mythology. That is a practical human reason. And now, because your mind loves a twist, you entertain the more mysterious version for a moment. What if, in some circles, the giant story was taken more literally? What if people believed their world was still haunted by the consequences of that ancient union, and they feared the implications, not because it would expose a scientific secret, but because it would destabilize the boundary between human and non-human, between moral responsibility and inherited doom? If you believe your origin is tangled with cosmic rebellion, you might start seeing yourself as a pawn in a bigger game that can lead to resignation or fanaticism or both. Neither is great for building a stable community. Also, neither is great for sleep, so we keep the tone gentle. Your lamp flickers, and you smile a little because it feels like a tiny dramatic assistant. It is doing its best. It is like, I too would like to contribute to the mood. Good job. Lamp. 10 out of 10. Please do not go out. You shift to another fresh angle. The giant's motif can also function as a critique of hybrid identity. In ancient societies, intermarriage, cultural mixing, and foreign influence often produced anxiety. People worried about losing tradition, losing language, losing covenant identity. Stories about forbidden unions can reflect that fear in a mythic form. The giants become a symbol of something mixed that is seen as dangerous. From a modern perspective, that symbolism can be troubling because it can be used to justify exclusion. That is one reason leaders might be cautious about how such stories are emphasized. Even if a text is ancient, its interpretation can shape behavior. A more cautious explanation could be that communities sought texts that supported ethical clarity and communal cohesion, and they treated the more fantastical expansions as instructive, but not foundational. Still, the cinematic what-if remains available, like a quiet door in the corner of the room. What if the giants are a memory of a real group of unusually tall warriors, magnified by storytelling? What if legends formed around elite fighters, bodyguards or foreign mercenaries who seemed enormous to local populations? Over time, the story grows. Size becomes symbolic. Human becomes myth. This is suggestive, not conclusive. And it is also, frankly, how a lot of legend making works. A story travels. Each retelling adds a little. The giant gets bigger. The sky gets darker. The moral gets sharper. The snack portion in the story also gets bigger, which is unfair because now you are hungry. Sorry, blame ancient storytelling, not me. You arrive at a low mound where the soil looks darker, as if it remembers water. You sit down, and you let the lamp rest beside you. The flame is steady. Your breathing slows. The night is calm. In this calm, you hold the balanced ladder again. Documented. Giants are a widespread motif, and Enoch expands earlier hints into a dramatic, moral narrative. Interpreted. Giants can represent violent, exploitative power and uncontrolled appetite, functioning as a warning about corruption that multiplies. Imagined, giants can also be treated as a haunting possibility, a myth that might preserve a distorted memory of events or encounters we cannot fully reconstruct. And if someone claims the book was sidelined because it tells the real origin, the most grounded response is that the origin it emphasizes is often the origin of intensified evil and corrupted knowledge, not a straightforward alternate creation account. You look up at the stars again. They do not blink, but they feel like they do, just slowly enough that you can pretend. You pick up a handful of dust and let it fall through your fingers. It pours like time, and you let one last thought land softly. Sometimes a story about giants is not trying to make you believe in giants. It is trying to make you recognize what feels giant in your own world, and to remember that even the biggest forces can be named, judged, and faced, at least in the realm of meaning. Your lamp crackles once, like a gentle punctuation mark, and the plane stays quiet, and you keep moving with the night, carrying both the warning and the mystery in the same slow, steady hand. You arrive at a place where the desert turns into a crossroads, not a dramatic stone monument with neon signs, just two warm paths meeting under a sky that looks freshly washed. The ground here is packed hard, scuffed by many feet, and the air smells like dust and distant smoke, like someone somewhere is cooking something simple. You pause, because crossroads are where choices happen. And tonight, the choice is not between left and right, it is between books. This part of the journey is quieter, more administrative, and somehow that makes it even more unsettling, because if you want to believe a book was removed to hide the real origin of humanity, you're imagining drama, you are imagining a secret, you're imagining a decisive moment. And what's broadly accepted is that sacred canons usually form through long processes that look less like a villain plotting and more like a community slowly settling into habits. The evidence we do have points to a mixture of use, authority, language, geography, and theological comfort level. In other words, the reason a book ends up inside the official set is often boring on the surface. And then, when you think about it, it becomes terrifying, because boring choices shape eternity. You walk down the middle of the crossroads, lamp held low, and you picture a room with shelves, not modern shelves, just stacks of scrolls, bundles, codices, and notes. A scribe sits at a low table, a teacher stands nearby, a few students linger in the doorway, trying to look serious, but mostly wondering when snacks happen. The point is, real people are involved. Most historians agree that in Judaism and Christianity, the concept of a fixed, universally recognised canon took time to settle. Different communities used different sets of texts. There were core writings that were widely shared, and there were other writings that were respected, read, debated, or loved without being treated as the final standard for doctrine. One interpretation is that canons formed because communities needed stability, especially under pressure. When life is chaotic, people want a trusted centre. They want texts that anchor identity, worship, and teaching. The more pressure a community experiences, the more it may prioritise clarity and continuity. That is not a conspiracy, that is survival. Now, to keep you engaged, let's make this concrete. Imagine you are a leader trying to teach ordinary people. You have a limited amount of time, and your audience is human, which means half of them are tired, a quarter are confused, and the rest are thinking about dinner. You choose texts that make your job possible. You choose texts that can be read in public without requiring a graduate seminar on angelic hierarchies and cosmic geography. And this is where Enoch becomes a complicated guest at the dinner table. Enoch can inspire awe. It can also inspire obsession. It can trigger endless speculation. It can lead to arguments about calendars, angels, heavenly journeys, and the mechanics of divine justice. Some leaders may have loved that. Others may have preferred texts that emphasize law, ethics, history, prophecy, and communal worship rhythms. A careful reading might suggest that even if Enoch was respected, it was not always considered essential for public life. If a text is not central to liturgy, it can remain on the edge, and edge texts are easier to lose. You stand at the crossroads and listen. No voices, just the faint sigh of wind. It is the perfect setting for a thought that feels like a small stone turning in your hand. Selection is not always rejection. Sometimes it is triage. Now the mystery angle, what if the reason for triage is not practical, but dangerous content? Here is the safest way to hold that possibility. It is possible that some leaders worried Enoch could be misused, not because it reveals a literal scientific origin, but because it reframes evil in a way that could destabilize accountability. If people think the main cause of corruption is non-human influence, they might blame everything on cosmic forces and excuse human choices. A more cautious explanation could be that communities wanted texts that keep moral responsibility clearly on human shoulders, even while acknowledging spiritual realities. That kind of concern could push a visionary text outward without any single dramatic ban. And now, because your mind wants a sharper picture, you imagine different filters that communities might use, even if they did not list them on a whiteboard. Apostolic or prophetic authority, meaning does it connect to recognized figures or traditions? Consistency with core teaching, meaning does it fit the theological center a community recognizes? Widespread use, meaning is it read across many regions, not just in one pocket? Language and accessibility, meaning can people actually read it in the languages they use? Public worship suitability, meaning can it be read aloud without causing chaos? Enoch tends to stumble on some of those filters depending on the community. Not everywhere, but enough places to matter. Now, for a new development that keeps the night from feeling like a lecture, you shift from abstract filters to the physical reality of texts. Books are not ideas. They are objects. Scrolls rot. Ink fades. Libraries burn. Wars scatter. Communities, climate ruins paper, and sometimes people simply stop copying something because it is not in weekly rotation. The result looks like a decision, but it can be the product of neglect. If you want to know why some writings survived, often the answer is because somebody copied them when times were hard. That is not romantic, but it is true. Still, the user question keeps its teeth, removed because it tells the real origin. So you open another door in the story, a door labelled authority anxiety. If a text claims to reveal heavenly secrets, it competes with institutions. It competes with priests. It competes with teachers. It competes with the calm, controllable flow of tradition. This does not mean institutions are evil. It means institutions protect coherence. And coherence can feel threatened when a book says, I have the secret map. One interpretation is that communities might have worried about charismatic individuals using Enoch to claim special knowledge. You know the type. The person who reads one unusual book and suddenly declares themselves the ultimate expert. Like, they downloaded wisdom overnight and now everyone must listen. Humans have always had that personality type. The only thing that changes is whether they have a microphone. So communities may have chosen a safer centre. And now comes your required debate marker, placed gently like a signpost at the crossroads. Historians still argue whether the boundaries of Jewish and Christian canons were shaped more by formal decisions, by gradual consensus, or by practical realities like language and geography. That argument matters because it affects how you imagine removal. If canon formation is gradual, removal is often just the shadow side of selection. Now you take a few steps down one path and then return, because the crossroads is a metaphor, and you are not trying to get lost at 2 a.m. Another new development. Different canons exist. Some Christian traditions preserved texts that others did not. Some communities treated certain writings as valuable for edification, but not for defining doctrine. The map is not one straight line. It is a web, and in a web, a text can be central in one area and peripheral in another. That is important because it undercuts the idea of a single global removal event. It suggests multiple local histories. Now let your imagination do something cinematic but responsible. Picture a traveller carrying a bundle of writings. They arrive in a town. The local community has its own favourites. The traveller reads from Enoch, and people listen. Some are thrilled, some are uneasy, some are bored, because not everyone is into cosmic architecture. A leader thanks the traveller and says, politely, "This is interesting, we will reflect on it." Then the community returns to the texts that structure their week. That is how a book can be known and still not become central. Now, you take the origin question and translate it into what people might actually fear. If Enoch suggests that human history is shaped by rebellious heavenly beings, that can imply the world is less stable than people want to admit. It can imply that spiritual rebellion is woven into reality. That can be theologically uncomfortable, not because it is scandalous, but because it can pull focus away from simpler teachings. Also, Enoch is heavy on judgment language. It is intense. It paints a cosmos where everything is recorded, weighed, and answered for. That can comfort the oppressed. But it can also make leaders nervous if they fear it will inflame apocalyptic expectation or social unrest. When people believe the end is near, they sometimes stop planting crops. That is bad for everyone, including the goats, who did not ask to be part of your eschatology. So, one interpretation is that leaders tried to manage the emotional temperature of their communities by favouring texts that balance warning with stability. Again, practical, human, not necessarily secretive, but the what if remains. What if someone did try to suppress it? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the most plausible form of suppression in the ancient world is not a worldwide hunt, it is local discouragement. It is a teacher saying, "Do not build your theology on that." It is a leader refusing to read it publicly. It is a school preferring other texts. Over time, that discouragement becomes disappearance. Suppression by neglect's the quietest kind. You sit at the crossroads, lamp beside you, and you watch the flame. It dances. It does not leap. It is calm, like it is practicing for a meditation class. You realize something that feels like a gentle twist. The mystery may not be about a hidden origin secret. It may be about how humans decide what counts as foundational truth. That decision is always shaped by context, need, and authority. Even when made with good intentions, it leaves shadows. And the shadow here is the longing for a single moment, a single reason, a single villain. But history rarely gives you that. So, you let the night hold a more nuanced picture. Enoch can be influential without being canonical. It can be cherished without being central. It can be read as warning literature rather than origin science. And it can be pushed to the margins, not because it reveals a literal recipe for humanity, but because it carries a kind of spiritual electricity that communities handle differently. You stand, the wind slides across the crossroads and smooths your footprints, as if the desert is reminding you how quickly evidence can vanish. You lift the lamp and choose a path, not because it is the only path, but because movement itself keeps the mind from spiralling into the same theories, and you keep walking in the quiet, carrying one steady thought. Sometimes the most powerful forces in history are not dramatic removals, but slow, ordinary selections that feel invisible until you wake up centuries later and realize your bookshelf is missing a door. You wander into a high, open stretch of desert where the wind finally has room to stretch its arms. It slides past you with a low, steady hush, like the world's softest white noise machine. The sky is still dark, but the stars feel brighter here, as if altitude gives them extra confidence. Your lamp flame is smaller now, more careful, and you find yourself walking with your body slightly angled, instinctively shielding the light like you are carrying a tiny secret. Tonight's new development is not giants or councils or rumours, it is time itself. Because one of the most intriguing and surprisingly practical parts of Enoch is its obsession with the heavens, not in a vague, poetic way, but in a structured, almost technical way. The book contains elaborate descriptions of celestial movement, cosmic order, and calendars. The evidence we do have points to a world where keeping time was not just about scheduling brunch, it was about worship, festivals, identity, and authority. Most historians agree that ancient Jewish communities cared deeply about calendars, especially because festival dates and sacred rhythms depended on them, and in a world without universal clocks, disagreements about the calendar were not minor. They could split communities. They could create rival claims about who is keeping the covenant correctly. They could spark the kind of arguments that start as, actually, it's the third day, and end as, you are spiritually cancelled. One interpretation is that parts of Enoch reflect this very real tension. The text presents heavenly order as precise and divinely anchored, as if to say, time is not a human invention. Time is part of cosmic law. That is a mainstream safe anchor. Now you breathe in the cold air and notice how your own sense of time changes at night. Minutes get stretchy. Thoughts drift. You can stare at the stars and suddenly it is an hour later and you have mentally adopted a constellation as your pet. The ancient world felt that too, except they had fewer streetlights and more reasons to look up. Enoch's astronomy material can feel like a guidebook to a sky that's alive with meaning. It describes gates, pathways, winds, and cycles. It makes the cosmos feel like a temple with moving parts. In that mood, the stars are not just stars, they are signals, interpreted carefully. This can be seen as theological poetry aimed at grounding worship in an ordered creation. The world is not random, the sky has rules, the seasons arrive on schedule. That stability becomes a reassurance that moral order exists too, even if human history looks messy. But because you are also here for mystery, you let another possibility drift in, softly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that Enoch's detailed sky descriptions might preserve an echo of advanced astronomical knowledge that seems unusual for its time. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to people who love the thought that ancient texts are encoded with forgotten science. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what the text actually does. It blends observation, tradition, and symbolic structure. It does not read like a modern textbook. It reads like a sacred map of time. And sacred maps can still be sophisticated in their own way. You stop on a ridge where the wind is stronger and the lamp flame leans hard. You tuck your chin into your collar. The stars above you look fixed, but you know they move, slowly, steadily. That movement is the whole point. Time is motion you can't hold. Now, here is where the origin question becomes unexpectedly practical. If Enoch was viewed as challenging, it might not be because it tells a secret biological origin, but because it could support a rival calendar. If a community adopted a different calendar, their festivals would fall on different days. Their rhythms would separate from neighbours. Their identity would harden. That can be spiritually meaningful for some groups, but it can also create conflict. Leaders aiming for unity often prefer a shared rhythm. Shared time is shared as a community, so one interpretation is that Enoch's calendar material could have made some leaders uneasy, not because it reveals the origin of humanity, but because it could reorganize community life. It could shift authority toward those who claim to read the heavens correctly. That is the kind of thing that can quietly push a book toward the edges. You keep walking, and the wind makes a faint, constant sound that feels like the desert is whispering numbers. You imagine ancient observers tracking lunar cycles, watching solstices, noting the lengthening and shortening of shadows. This is not fantasy. Ancient people were careful sky watchers because their survival depended on seasons. Agriculture is basically a contract with the sky, and the sky does not accept late payments. So Enoch's cosmic focus can be understood as an attempt to align human life with a perceived divine schedule. And that brings in the theme of forbidden knowledge in a new way. Not only weapons and cosmetics, but knowledge of the heavenly schedule. When a text claims to reveal the structure of time, it claims a kind of authority that is hard to regulate. Now you settle into a new mental scene, different from the usual dramatic council fantasy. Picture a teacher who is tired of arguments. People keep asking which day is correct. People keep accusing each other of being wrong. The teacher is trying to keep the community from splitting like dry wood. The teacher might look at a highly detailed cosmic text and think, this will not calm anyone down. That is a human moment, and now your required debate marker arrives. As gentle as a breeze but firm as a stone, historians still argue whether Enoch's astronomical material reflects real sectarian calendar disputes, broader priestly traditions, or symbolic cosmology designed mainly for theological impact. That debate matters because it changes the motive story. If Enoch is tied to disputes about timekeeping, its marginalisation can be about community order, not hidden origins. But the night is not done offering you mystery. You look up and let your eyes soften until the stars blur slightly. In that blur, the sky feels less like points and more like a canopy. You think about the human urge to find patterns. You think about how we link stars into shapes and then pretend the shapes were always there. It is charming. It is also how myths are born. So what if Enoch's sky map is not just about calendars? What if it is a symbolic memory of something else, a journey, a migration, a ritual path, a mental map of reality itself? A careful reading might suggest that the astronomical sections are also about orientation, not just in time, but in meaning. Where you are in the cosmos, what you are responsible for, what you can expect. In that sense, the origin of humanity could be framed as the origin of our role. Humans are timekeepers, festival keepers, covenant keepers. We are creatures who count days and then assign them sacred weight. That is not biology. That is identity. And if a text emphasizes that identity in a particular way, it can challenge other authorities who also claim to define time. You smile to yourself because this is the kind of conflict that sounds small until you remember that the whole world runs on calendars. Change the calendar and you change everything. Work, rest, worship, trade, coordination. Imagine everyone in your city deciding to adopt a different week structure. You would not even know when to pretend to be productive. So a book about the heavens can be socially explosive. Now the cinematic what if becomes less about aliens and more about awe. What if the text is pointing at something else? What if its obsession with precision is a response to trauma? When the world feels unstable, people cling to systems, they cling to numbers, they cling to cycles, because cycles promise return. They promise that after darkness comes light, after exile comes home. After injustice comes judgment. In that reading, the astronomy is comfort. It is a lullaby made of measurements. You walk across a flat area where the sand is rippled like frozen waves. Each ripple catches your lamplight on one edge, making a pattern of alternating gold and shadow. You find your breathing syncing with your steps. The wind's hush becomes your background hum. Now you consider the modern claim again. Removed because it tells the real origin. If someone expects Enoch to tell a scientific origin, they may be missing how ancient people often used origin language. Origins can mean the beginning of a practice, the beginning of corruption, the beginning of a covenant. the beginning of a cosmic schedule. Origins can mean the first time humans broke alignment with heaven. And Enoch's astronomical sections are all about alignment. They imply that heaven has an order, and humans should mirror it. When humans mirror it, life is stable. When humans deviate, chaos spreads. That is a moral origin story embedded inside a timekeeping system. It is possible that later communities, especially those trying to keep worship and identity unified, did not want multiple competing cosmic schedules floating around. They may have preferred to define sacred time through more widely accepted traditions. That preference could be enough to keep Enoch out of the central set of texts. Even if people still found it fascinating, no secret origin, just a battle over the calendar, which is the most ancient form of arguing about what day it is. And now, because you deserve a small joke to keep the mood gentle, you imagine the ancient version of a comment thread. Someone posts, according to the heavenly tablets, the festival is on this day. Another replies, actually no, your calculations are cursed. A third just posts a goat emoji, the moderator bans everyone, the community fractures, history happens. You keep walking, and the stars stay steady, and your lamp keeps doing its brave little job. You arrive at a cluster of scrubby plants, their leaves tight and grey-green. You brush one lightly, and it releases a faint, sharp scent. It smells like survival. It smells like patience. And that becomes the final soft landing for this section. Enoch's sky-focused material may be one of the reasons it remained controversial or peripheral in some communities, not because it reveals a hidden origin of human biology, but because it touches the nerve of authority through the control of time. It offers an ordered cosmos that can comfort, challenge, or divide depending on how it is used. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence suggests the astronomy is deeply tied to ancient religious life, while the more sensational modern readings remain possibilities that rest mostly on mood rather than hard proof. You let the wind carry that thought away, like a whisper. The desert keeps its steady hush. Time keeps moving. The stars keep their slow dance. And you keep walking, not in a hurry, because the night is long and your mind is finally starting to feel calm enough to listen rather than chase. You drift into a ruined hillside settlement where broken stones lie in uneven rows, like teeth from an ancient mouth. The wind is calmer here, trapped by low walls that no longer protect anyone, and the air smells faintly of ash and dry clay. Your lamplight crawls over carved blocks and shallow doorways that lead nowhere. The place feels abandoned in a quiet, respectful way, as if it understands that silence is part of memory. This section brings a new development that changes the flavour of the mystery. Instead of asking what Enoch says about the heavenly beings, you ask what Enoch does to people living under pressure. Because what's broadly accepted is that apocalyptic literature often blossoms during periods of political strain, foreign domination, and social upheaval. In those seasons, ordinary life can feel like a long hallway with no exits. People work, pay taxes, bury hopes, repeat. And then a text arrives that says the universe is not indifferent. The universe is watching. The universe will judge. That message can be oxygen. Most historians agree that Jewish apocalyptic writing in the Second Temple era reflects a world shaped by empires and instability. The evidence we do have points to communities trying to make sense of suffering without giving up their belief that justice matters. Enoch fits that mood. It speaks in visions and cosmic courtrooms because a cosmic courtroom is what you dream of when earthly courts are corrupt. One interpretation is that Enoch's judgment themes are not just theology, They are protest. They are the spiritual language of people who cannot openly revolt. So they revolt in imagination. They picture mighty powers being called to account. They picture hidden crimes being exposed. They picture the whole system being reversed. And this is where your original question about real origin can take a surprising turn. Sometimes origin is not about how humanity began. Sometimes it is about why humanity suffers, why the world feels hostile, why cruelty seems to reproduce. Enoch answers that question by saying the problem is deep, cosmic, and not ignored. You walk through a narrow lane between fallen walls, and your lamp shows scratches on stone, little marks that might have been made by tool or by accident. You imagine hands building, hands repairing, hands fleeing, not with gore, not with horror, just with a soft ache, when places fall apart. They do it quietly most of the time. Now you meet Enoch's biggest emotional engine, judgment. The text imagines a universe where every act has weight, where oppression is not permanent, where the powerful do not get the final word. That is comforting for the powerless. It is also unsettling for anyone who benefits from the status quo. So here is a practical human possibility. If a community leader worries that apocalyptic intensity will inflame unrest or despair, they might hesitate to center such a text in public worship, not because it is false, but because it is combustible. A more cautious explanation could be that communities chose to emphasize writings that sustain daily ethical living, without constantly pulling the mind toward the end of the world. Now, to keep you from getting bored, we shift to a fresh angle. Enoch's judgment is not only directed at humans, it is directed at cosmic beings too. In the narrative, even mighty watchers face consequences. Even the heavenly realm has accountability. That is a radical idea in a world where earthly rulers often act like they are untouchable. If you are living under empire, hearing that even the powers above can be judged might feel like a secret weapon, not a sword, but a story that refuses to accept permanent injustice. It tells you that the universe is not owned by the oppressor. That can be empowering. It can also be politically sensitive. One interpretation is that such themes could have made some authorities nervous, especially if they feared that people would read the text as a coded call to resist. Scholars continue to debate how directly apocalyptic texts influence social behaviour, but it is reasonable to say they shaped imagination, and imagination shapes what people believe is possible. You step into what used to be a courtyard. The ground is uneven, and your lamp reveals a shallow basin cracked down the middle. You picture water collecting here long ago, reflecting the sky. Now it holds only dust, and that basin becomes a metaphor. Enoch holds a reflection of cosmic justice, but communities decide whether to keep that reflection in the centre of their life or at the edges. Now comes your required debate marker, placed gently among the stones. Historians still argue whether apocalyptic judgment literature primarily served as comfort for oppressed communities, as critique of corrupt leadership, or as a broader theological exploration of evil and justice. All three can be true at once, depending on context. Now, because the channel's balance demands mystery too, we let a cinematic possibility drift in without pretending it is fact. What if the judgment scenes are not only symbolic visions? What if they preserve echoes of ancient experiences that felt like contact with something beyond ordinary perception? Not necessarily aliens with flashing lights, but altered states, intense rituals, profound dreams, moments of collective fear, moments when the mind feels as if it is standing in a courtroom, bigger than the world. This theory is not widely accepted as a literal external event, but it is a possibility in the sense that human consciousness can produce vivid experiences, especially under stress, fasting, or ritual. and ancient communities often interpreted such experiences as encounters with the divine realm. So the judgment vision can be both psychological and theological. That does not make it less meaningful. It makes it more human. Now you bring it back to the origin question with a new twist. Enoch sometimes treats the world's brokenness as something that entered through boundary crossing and corrupted teaching. In that frame, the origin of humanity's crisis is not simply human error, it is the entanglement of humanity with forces that amplify error. That is a powerful idea. It can feel like relief, because it explains why you struggle. It can also feel like danger, because it implies you are caught in a bigger conflict. If a community is trying to foster responsibility, they might worry that people will lean too hard into cosmic blame. They might hear Enoch and say, so it was the watchers, not us. And then ethics get slippery. A careful reading might suggest Enoch does not let humans off the hook. It still calls for righteousness. It still condemns injustice. But humans are very good at selective reading, especially when it helps them feel less guilty. We can all find that one paragraph that excuses our behaviour if we squint hard enough. That is why some leaders prefer texts that leave less room for cosmic scapegoating. Now, a fresh development that keeps the story moving. Enoch's judgment language also creates a worldview where history has an endpoint. It frames time as moving toward a resolution. That can comfort people who feel trapped. It can also create impatience. If you believe the end is near, you might withdraw from long-term projects. You might treat ordinary life as pointless. You might stop caring about the slow work of building a just society. Some communities embraced apocalyptic urgency, others tried to temper it. So the marginalisation of a highly apocalyptic text can be understood as a kind of emotional regulation at the community level. Again, not a villain, but a thermostat. You walk along the edge of the settlement where the hillside drops off. Below, the land slopes into darkness. You hear a single bird call, short and low, like a question that does not demand an answer. The night stays calm. Now you let the cinematic what if take one gentle step further. What if the book's vivid judgment scenes were seen as dangerous because they threatened existing power structures? Not necessarily imperial power in a direct way, but religious authority too. A text that claims to reveal heavenly verdicts can undermine leaders who prefer to be the ones interpreting God's will. If people believe a visionary text offers a direct window into divine judgment, they may listen to it more than to their local teachers. That can create tension. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it is a plausible human dynamic. Now you touch the wall of a ruined room. The stone is cool. It grounds you again. You remind yourself of the truth ladder, documented. Apocalyptic literature rises in periods of pressure and offers cosmic justice, interpreted. Enoch's judgment scenes may function as protest, comfort, and moral warning. Imagined, you can treat the courtroom visions as cinematic glimpses into an otherworldly drama, without insisting they are literal transcripts from heaven. And if someone claims Enoch was removed because it tells the real origin of humanity, one grounded response is that the origin it highlights may be the origin of intensified evil and injustice, and that its intense judgment worldview could have been considered spiritually useful but socially challenging. You step back into the courtyard and sit on a stone block that might once have been a threshold. Your lamp is steady beside you. The flame looks calm, like it is not worried about cosmic verdicts. It is just doing its job. You let your voice soften in your own head. You imagine someone listening to this at night, in a modern bedroom. Fan humming, phone face down on the pillow. You want them to feel curious, not anxious, so you keep the last image gentle. You picture the ancient world as a place where people looked up at the same stars you see now, and they wrote stories that promised justice without demanding panic. They imagined a moral universe because the alternative was despair. The ruins around you stay quiet. The sky stays wide. The lamp keeps its small circle of warmth. And you keep walking through the night, carrying the idea that judgment, in Enoch's world, is not horror. It is hope shaped like a courtroom. Hope that refuses to let cruelty be the final story. You walk into a small oasis town at the edge of nowhere, the kind of place that exists because a spring refuses to quit. Date palms sway gently, and the air smells like damp earth mixed with sweet fruit and a faint hint of smoke. The soundscape changes too. Instead of pure wind, you hear distant murmurs, a donkey shifting its weight, the soft clink of pottery, and the low, conversational hum of people who have learned how to live with scarcity. This section's new development is a single quotation that behaves like a tiny hook, not a giant myth, not a sky map, not a cosmic courtroom, just a small line from a later text that points back to Enoch like a finger saying, "That one mattered." Most historians agree that the New Testament letter called Jude includes a quotation or close reference to Enoch. That is widely accepted, and it is a key reason Enoch stays in the conversation. It is like finding a cameo in an old film. You might not know the actor, but now you are squinting at the screen, thinking, wait, who is that, and why are they here? One interpretation is that early Christian communities were familiar with Enoch and considered it useful, even if they did not all treat it as scripture in the same way. In the ancient world, quoting a text did not automatically place it inside a fixed canon. People quoted respected writings, popular teachings, and shared traditions. Quotations were like endorsements, but not always like official adoption. That is the solid ground. Now the what if mood slides in quietly. What if that quotation is not just a casual reference? What if it is a breadcrumb? A sign that early believers recognized Enoch as carrying something potent, maybe even something foundational, and that later decisions softened that potency by placing Enoch outside the main collection. That is a possibility, not a certainty. You wander through the town's narrow lane. The ground is packed. Walls are made of mud brick that holds the day's heat and releases it slowly at night, like the building itself is exhaling. You pass a small courtyard where someone has left a clay cup upside down to keep dust out. It is such a simple gesture, and it makes you feel oddly tender toward the past. Now you lean into the new angle. Early Christianity was messy in the way all living movements are messy. Different communities emphasize different teachings. Some texts spread quickly, some spread slowly, some are copied often, some are quoted and then fade. The process of forming a New Testament collection also took time, and along the way, communities used a range of writings for instruction and encouragement. So the presence of an Enoch quotation tells you something important. Enoch was in the air. It was part of the library of ideas early believers could reach for. But the quotation also raises questions. Why quote Enoch at all? One interpretation is that Jude uses Enoch to support a warning against corrupt influences and false teachers. That fits Enoch's moral intensity and its focus on judgment. In that reading, Enoch functions like a familiar reference point for the audience, a shared story used to underline an ethical message. It is less about origins and more about accountability. And now, to keep your listeners from drifting, you shift to a fresh development. Early Christian leaders had to navigate imagination. The earliest Jesus movement inherited Jewish scriptures and Jewish interpretive traditions. It also encountered new cultural worlds as it spread. That meant leaders were constantly making choices about which stories to emphasize. Enoch's angelology and cosmic drama could resonate deeply, but it could also invite confusion, especially as communities debated who Jesus is how angels fit into the picture, and how to keep worship centered. A more cautious explanation could be that some communities valued Enoch as a useful tradition, but hesitated to elevate it to the same level as texts they believed had direct apostolic authority or broader communal acceptance. That kind of hesitation does not require a conspiracy, it requires prioritization. Now the town spring comes into view. Water glints in your lamplight. It is a small pool, not dramatic, but in the desert it looks like a miracle. You kneel and dip your fingers in. The water is cool. It makes your skin feel suddenly awake. Water becomes your metaphor for transmission. A quotation is like a sip. It tells you a spring exists somewhere. It does not tell you how many people drank from it or whether it became the town's main water source. Now, because your viewers love the mystery angle, you let it step closer while keeping it labelled. A fringe idea proposes that Enoch was more central in some early Christian circles than later Orthodox collections would suggest, and that its gradual sidelining was part of a broader effort to standardise belief. This theory isn't widely accepted as a simple, unified plan, because early Christianity was not one centralised institution at first. It was a network. But it is possible that as leaders sought unity, they favoured texts that were widely used and could serve as common ground. Enoch, being vivid and complex, might have been harder to use as common ground. Now comes your required debate marker, calm and clear. Historians still argue whether Jude's use of Enoch reflects a widespread early Christian acceptance of Enoch, a localised familiarity, or the use of a popular tradition for rhetorical force. That debate matters because it changes what the quotation means. It could signal deep reliance. It could signal casual familiarity. It could signal a shared cultural reference. The text itself does not settle the question definitively. Now, another new development. Jude is not alone in the broader sense. Early Christian thought includes themes that echo Enoch, such as the idea of rebellious spiritual beings, cosmic conflict, and judgment of unseen powers. This does not prove direct dependence in every case, but it suggests a shared imaginative environment. Apocalyptic ideas were part of the air. So Enoch's influence may be more like a scent than like a footprint. You cannot always see it. You can sometimes feel it. You stand and let your hands dry in the night breeze. The town is quiet. Somewhere someone laughs softly. A brief burst of warmth. Then the night folds back over it. Now you consider a practical reason Enoch might not have become universally canonical in mainstream Christianity. Translations and accessibility. Early Christian communities increasingly used Greek and later Latin. Enoch's transmission history is complicated, and texts that are not widely available in a common language tend to drift outward. Communities build canons from what they can read, copy, and teach consistently. That is mundane but powerful. You walk past a doorway and glimpse a family eating quietly, sharing bread, speaking in low voices. Ordinary life again. It is a reminder that a canon is not built by abstract theory alone. It is built by what people actually read, aloud, together. Now you bring the origin question into this setting. If someone believes Enoch tells the real origin of humanity, they may point to the Watchers and the giants and say, "There, that is the secret." But Jude's use of Enoch in many interpretations is not focused on origin. It is focused on warning and judgment. It is using Enoch's moral force, not necessarily its cosmology, to address behaviour. So one grounded conclusion is that early Christian interest in Enoch may have been more ethical and apocalyptic than biological, but that does not dissolve the mystery, it shifts it. The mystery becomes, why did some communities keep this kind of literature close, while others kept it at arm's length? Here the cinematic what if offers a gentle, sleep-friendly thought. What if communities sense that Enoch's imagery could pull focus away from the central story they were trying to tell about Jesus, faith, and ethical living? What if they feared people would get lost in angel names and cosmic maps and forget the simple demands of love, humility, and justice? That is plausible and human. Now, a final fresh angle to close this section. Quotations are clues not just about texts, but about audiences. Jude's audience likely recognised the reference. That suggests Enoch was known enough to function as shared material, at least in some circles. The text did not need to explain it like a brand new concept. It could simply use it. That is significant. It means Enoch was not hidden. It was part of the cultural library, and that undercuts the idea that Enoch was removed because it contained a secret too dangerous to know. If it were truly forbidden in that sense, it would not show up as a casual supporting reference in a letter meant to be read aloud. Unless, of course, you lean into the more mysterious possibility that it was known early and then later faded as priorities and power structures changed. That is possible, not proven, but possible. You leave the spring and walk toward the edge of the oasis. The palms thin out, the wind grows cleaner, the stars are still overhead, indifferent and beautiful. You take one slow breath and let your body relax. In the end, this section gives you a quiet but important shift. Enoch's presence in early Christian quotation suggests influence and familiarity. It does not automatically prove canonical status. It does not automatically prove suppression. It does show that the book's themes and authority were taken seriously enough to be used as moral reinforcement. And if there is a secret in that, it is not a hidden origin formula. It is the secret of how texts move through communities, sometimes in full, sometimes in fragments, sometimes as a single line that survives like a spark, even when the larger fire is harder to keep burning. You follow a winding track that leaves the oasis behind and climbs into cooler air. The ground turns darker, more packed with gravel, and the sky feels closer, as if the stars are leaning in to listen. Far ahead, you see a faint glow that is not sunrise and not fire, something steadier, like lanterns in a distant highland village. As you approach, the scent of wood smoke and roasted grain drifts towards you, warm and comforting, the smell of people who know how to make night feel safe. This section's new development is geography, and geography is one of the most underrated villains and heroes in history, not because it has motives, but because it quietly decides what survives. Most historians agree that the Book of Enoch survived in full form, primarily through the Ethiopian Christian tradition, preserved in Ge'ez for centuries, while it became less available elsewhere. That is widely accepted in the broad outline of its transmission history. In many other regions, Enoch was known in fragments or through references, but the complete work was not as commonly present in everyday use. One interpretation is that this survival story has less to do with a worldwide suppression and more to do with regional continuity. Communities that copy texts regularly preserve them. Communities that stop copying them lose them. And because Ethiopia maintained a strong, continuous Christian literary tradition with its own canon, Enoch could remain part of the living library rather than slipping into obscurity. That is the solid ground. Now the cinematic what if enters like a soft drum beat. What if a book survives in one place because it is meant to? What if the mountain roads and the distance from major imperial centres acted like a protective shell, keeping a controversial text safe, while other regions gradually let it go? Not in a secret agent way, but in the way that a tucked-away family recipe survives in one household when everyone else forgets it. That is a mood, not proof, but it is a beautiful possibility. You reach the village and notice the details. The buildings are stone and timber. The pathways are narrow. People move calmly, not hurried, as if they have learned that rushing does not change the night. You hear the soft rhythm of chanting from somewhere, not loud, just a steady pulse, like breath. Your lamp feels almost unnecessary among the village lights, but you keep it anyway because it makes you feel like you belong in the story. Now you shift to a fresh angle, canon diversity. What's broadly accepted is that not all Christian traditions share the exact same set of canonical books. Some traditions include writings, others do not. This is not a scandal. It is a historical reality shaped by language, geography, and ecclesiastical development. So when people ask why Enoch was removed, they sometimes assume there was one universal canon and one universal deletion. But the existence of a tradition that kept Enoch challenges that simplification. It suggests a different framing, not removed everywhere, but not adopted everywhere. That is a crucial difference. Now, to keep the listener engaged, you give the village a role. You imagine a scriptorium or a monastery library, not a grand palace, just a room with shelves, ink, and careful hands. A scribe sits, dipping a reed pen, copying characters slowly. Each stroke is a vote for survival. Each page is a bridge across time. This is not romantic fantasy. It is how texts endure. Now the mystery angle gets a new shape. If Enoch was preserved in Ethiopia, what does that imply about its perceived value? One interpretation is that Ethiopian Christianity found Enoch spiritually useful and compatible with its theological worldview. It may have supported certain themes that resonated, such as cosmic justice, angelic hierarchies, and apocalyptic hope. A more cautious explanation could be that once a text becomes part of a tradition's canonical or semi-canonical set, it gains liturgical and educational uses that reinforce its transmission. In other words, inclusion creates copying, and copying creates survival. Now, because your audience loves an eerie possibility, you let one drift in with careful framing. A fringe idea proposes that Enoch survived in certain regions because it carried teachings that others quietly feared, and that those regions acted as guardians of older, less standardized traditions. This theory isn't widely accepted as a coordinated plan, but it can be treated as a possibility in the sense that marginal regions sometimes preserve older practices precisely because they are less affected by centralizing pressures. That is plausible as a general historical pattern, even if the motives are not provable. Now comes your required debate marker, gentle and clear. Historians still argue whether Enoch's fuller preservation in Ethiopia reflects deliberate theological preference, historical accident of manuscript survival, or the practical effects of language and regional literary continuity. The debate exists because history is rarely neat. It is usually a pile of overlapping reasons. Now, another new development, language is not just a tool, it is a gate. If a text is widely available in the dominant languages of a region, it can circulate. If it is not translated or not copied, it becomes hard to access. Over time, texts that remain accessible become the normal canon, and texts that become rare start to feel extra, not necessarily wrong, just unfamiliar. So a book's fate can hinge on translation choices made by scribes who were probably just trying to finish their work before their eyes gave out. Again, history, shaped by tired humans doing their best. You wander to the edge of the village where a small church stands. Its doors are closed, but you can smell incense lingering in the wood, sweet and resinous. That scent becomes the new anchor. Incense is memory in smoke form. It rises, it disappears, and yet it leaves its mark. Enoch, in this section, is like incense. It rises in one tradition and lingers there, even as elsewhere the scent fades. Now you bring the origin question into the Ethiopian setting without repeating old points. Instead, you consider how origin might feel in a tradition that preserves Enoch. If Enoch is read and valued, the watcher's narrative might be treated as part of the moral landscape, shaping how people understand temptation, knowledge, and spiritual conflict. In that environment, the real origin claim might not be about biology at all. It might be about explaining how the world became spiritually complicated, how humans are tempted by power, how evil is not only personal, but systemic and cosmic. That kind of origin story can be comforting because it says your struggle is not random. It has context. It has meaning. Now, the cinematic what if shifts again. What if the reason the book survived in one place is that it offered a special kind of comfort under hardship? Highland communities know hardship. They know drought, political upheaval, isolation, and the slow grind of endurance. A text that promises cosmic justice and accountability might feel like a companion. So the survival of Enoch might reflect emotional usefulness as much as theological alignment. Now you notice a child carrying a bundle of firewood, moving carefully but confidently. The child glances at you, curious, not afraid, then continues. Ordinary life again. It grounds you. These texts were not preserved for internet debates. They were preserved for communities, for worship, for teaching, for comfort. Now you step into another fresh angle. The myth of a single global censorship event is emotionally satisfying because it provides a villain. But the Ethiopian preservation story encourages a more complex picture. It suggests that the history of Enoch is a patchwork, with different regions making different choices, shaped by different needs. That complexity does not kill mystery, it deepens it. Instead of asking who removed it, you ask, why did some keep it? And that is a more interesting question, because it opens many doors. A careful reading might suggest that a text's survival depends on three quiet forces: community demand, institutional support, and material resources. If a monastery has scribes, ink, and time, it can preserve a large text. If a community uses a text in worship or teaching, it has motivation. If political conditions allow stability, manuscripts survive. Those are mundane forces, but together they create the miracle of memory. You stand under the village lights and let the warmth sink into your shoulders. The wind is gentle. The chanting has softened into silence. The world feels safe. Now you let one last mysterious thought float by, as light as a moth's wing. What if the real origin people are searching for is not hidden in a secret chapter, but in the very fact of survival? A book that persists through centuries, carried by hands, copied by candlelight, chosen again and again, suggests that the ideas inside it met real human needs. That is not proof of aliens or genetic secrets. It is proof of resonance, and resonance itself is a clue. You take a slow breath, smelling wood smoke and faint incense. You look up at the stars. They are the same stars seen by scribes and monks and villagers who did not know your name, but helped carry a text into your world anyway. The night stays calm, and the village stays quiet, and you keep walking, holding the idea that sometimes the most astonishing part of a mystery is not what was lost, but what was kept, and how quietly it was kept, like a lamp protected from wind on a long, patient road. You leave the village lights behind and step into a wide, silent plateau where the ground is firm and the air is crisp, the kind of cold that feels clean. The stars are still overhead, but now there is a faint ribbon of pale light at the horizon, not quite dawn, more like the sky practicing. Your lamp throws a small circle on the gravel, and beyond that circle the world becomes a soft, velvety unknown. This section's new development is the big question in a new costume. What do you mean by origin? Because the phrase real origin of humanity can mean several different things, and your answer changes depending on what meaning you pick. If you mean biological origin, you're asking about creation, evolution, bodies, and beginnings. If you mean moral origin, you are asking why humans do harm and why the world feels morally crooked. If you mean cultural origin, you are asking how societies learned power, violence, and technology. If you mean spiritual origin, you are asking how humans relate to the unseen. Most historians agree that the Book of Enoch is best understood as a work that expands and interprets earlier traditions rather than replacing them with a totally separate creation account that is widely accepted in the broad scholarly approach to the text. It is not a new Genesis. It is an expansion of themes, especially around how evil and corruption enter the world. One interpretation is that Enoch reframes the human problem. Instead of focusing only on a human choice, it emphasizes the role of corrupted knowledge and boundary-breaking influences. The story becomes less about a single bite of fruit and more about the spread of systems and teachings that distort human life. That is a different kind of origin story. Now the cinematic what-if enters gently, like the sound of distant drums. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if origin is not about how humans were made, but about how humans became what they are now, restless, clever, conflicted, hungry for meaning, and oddly fascinated by forbidden doors. You keep walking, and as you walk, you notice the plateau is scattered with stones that look like they were arranged long ago. Not a perfect circle, not a clear monument, just a hint of human patterning. It makes you think about the human need to mark space, to say, I was here. That need is itself an origin clue. Humans are the kind of creatures who leave marks. Now, to avoid repetition, you take a fresh approach to the controversial claim. Some modern readers treat Enoch as if it contains hidden science about human engineering by non-human beings. They connect the Watcher's narrative to ideas about genetic manipulation or hybrid creation. This is a popular modern interpretation in certain circles, but it is not widely accepted among mainstream historians and scholars of ancient literature. That does not mean you cannot explore it. It means you explore it with labels. A fringe idea proposes that the Watcher's story is a coded description of intervention in human development. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we need to ask what would we expect to see if that were true. We might expect consistent ancient testimony across diverse sources that clearly describe such intervention in non-symbolic terms. We might expect artifacts or records that point to technologies far beyond the time. We might expect physical evidence that does not rely on interpretive leaps. And the evidence we do have points mostly to mythic storytelling, theological reflection and cultural anxiety, not to unambiguous scientific intervention. That is important. It keeps the story sleep-friendly, grounded, and honest. Now you shift to a new development that feels like turning a key. Enoch does something subtle. It makes knowledge itself the dramatic object. In many myths, the drama is about power or love or war. In Enoch, the drama includes instruction, teaching, transfer of skill. The story treats certain knowledge as morally dangerous when separated from responsibility. That is a theme that can apply to every era. One interpretation is that Enoch is describing the origin of a particular human condition, the gap between what humans can do and what humans should do. The moment humans learn powerful techniques, the ethical demand rises. And if ethics fails to rise, the world tilts toward harm. That gap is painfully modern. You can practically hear your phone buzzing with notifications about new technology while your conscience tries to load the update and keep spinning. So when people say Enoch tells the real origin, perhaps they are sensing this. The real origin of humanity's recurring crisis is not our bodies. It is our relationship to knowledge and power. Now comes your required debate marker, calm and clear on the plateau. Historians still argue whether Enoch's expansions of Genesis should be read mainly as theological interpretation, as social critique aimed at corrupt elites, or as mythic storytelling shaped by older Near Eastern motifs. And because they argue, you get to hold multiple layers without forcing a final verdict. Now you kneel by one of the arranged stones. It is rough, cold and speckled. You run your fingers over it. There is no inscription, no label, just presence. It reminds you that humans often build meaning with materials that do not speak back. So you try a new angle on the removed because it reveals origin claim. Suppose a community worries that Enoch encourages people to obsess over hidden backstory instead of living ethically. That is a common human temptation. We love origin stories because they make the present feel explained. But sometimes the obsession becomes avoidance. People chase cosmic law and neglect their neighbour. A more cautious explanation could be that leaders preferred texts that keep the focus on covenant ethics, worship and communal life, rather than texts that invite endless speculation about invisible beings and primordial events. That is practical. It also fits what communities often do. Now, you let the cinematic what-if take a softer, more philosophical shape, so it does not turn into a late-night paranoia spiral. What if the real secret is simply that ancient people did not draw the same line we draw between myth and history? They could tell a story about watchers and still be making a moral claim about society. They could describe giants and still be criticising exploitation. They could map the heavens and still be arguing about how to live on Earth. So perhaps the origin Enoch offers is not a secret fact, but a lens, a way of seeing the human world as connected to moral order, connected to cosmic accountability. That lens can feel dangerous to those who prefer a simpler world. Now you stand and resume walking. The sky at the horizon brightens a little more. The plateau feels less like a void and more like a stage where the day is preparing its entrance. You notice your lamp is nearly out. The flame is small. It makes you smile because it is like a stubborn little storyteller insisting on finishing the point. Here is the point in its most balanced form. Documented. Enoch is an interpretive, visionary work that expands earlier traditions, widely influential in some ancient circles. Interpreted, it offers an origin story of moral corruption tied to boundary crossing and the misuse of knowledge. And it may reflect real social anxieties about power and cultural change. Imagined, it can be read as a mysterious hint of something stranger, but that reading remains speculative and thinly evidenced. So, if someone says Enoch was removed because it tells the real origin of humanity, the most grounded reply is that it likely tells a real origin story in the sense of explaining why the world feels morally fractured. It does not clearly replace mainstream creation narratives with a fully separate biological blueprint, and the reasons it was not universally central may be rooted in how communities manage authority, interpretation, and emotional intensity. You take one last look at the stones, at the sky, at the thin light rising. You breathe in the cold, clean air. Your mind feels quieter now, less hungry to solve the mystery in one bite. Because the story is not a single locked box, it is a landscape. And on this plateau, with the night thinning and the day approaching, you let yourself accept a gentle truth. The most powerful origin stories are not always the ones that tell you how you were made. They are the ones that tell you what you are up against, and what you are responsible for, and why you keep reaching for the stars even when your hands are full of dust. You walk down from the plateau into a gentle valley where the first light finally arrives. Not bright and bossy, but soft and grey gold, like the morning is trying not to slam the door. The air warms by tiny degrees. The world begins to show its colours again. Gravel becomes brown and red instead of simply dark. The shrubs reveal their dusty green. Your lamp flame trembles, then steadies, then looks almost embarrassed, like it knows the sun is clocking in. This final stretch brings a new development that feels almost too quiet for such a big question. The real mystery might be your own hunger for a single hidden answer. What's broadly accepted is that the Book of Enoch is influential, debated, and unevenly preserved across traditions, and that its exclusion from many mainstream canons can be explained by a mix of authority, use, language, and communal preference, rather than one universal act of deletion. That is the solid ground. One interpretation is that the story you tell yourself about a removed book says as much about modern psychology as it does about ancient history. Humans love the idea that the truth is hidden, because a hidden truth feels like a prize. It gives you a villain to blame and a hero role to play. It makes the world feel like a puzzle with a neat solution. But history is rarely neat. And now, to keep the balance with the mystery angle, you allow the possibility without letting it harden into certainty. It is possible that some communities discourage the public use of Enoch because it was seen as too speculative, too intense, or too easy to misuse. It is also possible that local choices, political pressures, and shifts in teaching priorities gradually pushed it to the edges in many places. That kind of slow sidelining can feel like removal, even when it is more like drift. Now comes your required debate marker, placed gently into the morning air. Historians still argue whether Enoch's marginalization in many traditions was mainly a result of theological boundaries, practical transmission history, or concern over interpretive excess. All three can braid together. You walk along a shallow streambed where, surprisingly, a thin ribbon of water actually runs, reflecting the pale sky. It is not enough to swim in. It is enough to remind you that dryness is not absolute. You crouch, touch the water, and let it cool your fingertips. The sensation is clean and real. Now you bring the truth ladder into a single calm picture. Documented, Enoch expands earlier traditions about heavenly beings, corruption, and judgment, and it circulated widely in some ancient contexts, while surviving fully in certain traditions. Interpreted, it can be read as a moral origin story, explaining how human life becomes twisted through the misuse of knowledge and the crossing of boundaries, and it may reflect social anxieties about power, foreign influence, and community cohesion. Imagined, you can treat its watchers giants and cosmic courtrooms as a cinematic possibility, a whisper of something beyond ordinary life, while still acknowledging that the evidence for literal non-human engineering or a secret scientific blueprint remains thin. And that is the point where your original question becomes easier to hold without needing to solve it. If someone says, it was removed because it tells the real origin, you can answer with a gentler, sturdier idea. Enoch might tell a real origin in the sense that it names a pattern. Humans reach for power, learn fast, and struggle to stay wise. Humans are tempted by knowledge without responsibility. Humans are vulnerable to systems that amplify harm. That is not a secret origin. It is an honest mirror. And mirrors make people uncomfortable. Now, for the cinematic what if, The morning light helps you frame it safely. What if the book's real power is not in hidden facts, but in the emotional realism of its myth? What if the watchers are the part of you that wants shortcuts? What if the giants are the part of society that grows too big and starts eating everything? What if the judgment courtroom is your longing to believe that cruelty does not get the last word? That is interpretation blended with imagination, not a claim of literal identity. You stand and follow the stream as it bends through the valley. Birds begin to call, not loudly, just enough to stitch sound into the morning. A small lizard darts across a stone and freezes, pretending it has always been a decorative feature. You respect the commitment. You also realise you have been listening to stories for a long time, and your body is ready to rest. So the story slows down now. You let your steps become smaller. You let your shoulders loosen. You let your breathing deepen. The sun rises another inch, and the desert changes from mystery theatre to ordinary landscape. The rocks are just rocks again. The shadows retreat. Even your lamp seems to relax, the flame shrinking as if it is ready to retire. And you carry one last balanced thought. The Book of Enoch can be a fascinating window into how ancient people imagined the cosmos, evil, justice, and the moral weight of knowledge. Its presence in some traditions and absence in others can be explained without demanding a single dramatic purge. At the same time, the book's vivid imagery invites endless speculation, and it is understandable that some readers feel it holds a missing piece of the puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Now, the wind down begins and the vocabulary softens and the sentences stretch out because your mind deserves a gentle landing. You walk until you find a smooth, flat stone warmed by the early sun, and you sit there like it is the most natural seat in the world. You set the lamp beside you, letting it glow faintly, more a companion than a guide now. You listen to the thin stream. You listen to the birds. You listen to the quiet way the morning arrives without asking permission, and you let the whole night's question become less sharp, not because it is unimportant, but because it does not need to be clenched in your fist. It can rest in your open palm. If there is a secret, it might be simple. Ancient people were trying to explain why the world feels both beautiful and broken. They told stories that gave shape to invisible pressures. They imagined watchers because it can feel like you are being watched by consequences. They imagined giants because injustice can feel enormous. They imagined judgment because the heart wants fairness more than it wants comfort. And when communities chose which writings would sit at the centre of their life, they were not only choosing facts, they were choosing rhythms. They were choosing how much mystery to carry in public, and how much to keep for quiet nights when the stars are bright and the mind is wide open. So you do not have to solve it to let it soothe you. You can let it be a puzzle, an open question, a debated interpretation. You can let the solid ground remain solid, and you can let the mist remain mist. You can be curious without being consumed. The sun warms your face, your eyelids grow heavier. The stream keeps its small song. The desert looks ordinary and kind. Your lamp finally goes out with no drama at all. Just a soft surrender, like a whisper deciding it has said enough. And in that gentle light, you let the question drift away, not answered, but held and then released, as if the morning itself is telling you it is safe to rest now. End of script. Sweet dreams.